This will be the first of a series for the Philosophers and Their Own Words playlist on Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols. I'll probably combine them for the Great Texts in Philosophy playlist after that. I'll be using the Richard Polt translation, published by Hackett. As a general rule, for most purposes, I think the public domain translations of the great texts of philosophy you can find on the internet are pretty good, but they're usually not the best, and if you want the best translation and money is not an issue, go find a better one. For quality translations that are affordable, I do, as a general rule, recommend Hackett. I'll be using Hackett here. Let's look at the title and the subtitle. The Twilight of the Idols has the subtitle, How to Philosophize with the Hammer. Now, when he's talking about idols and hammers, one image that comes easily to mind is that of the iconoclast smashing idols with the hammer. And let's first say what would be right about this image, and then move to what's wrong about this image. The connection to Christianity and the divergence from Christianity ought to be understood as much as possible. Think of a Christian going around smashing idols, an iconoclast, and saying, these are not real gods. I take my hammer and I smash them because they're not real gods. I violently tear them down to make way for the worship of the true God. A Christian might be conceived of as doing that, or perhaps metaphorically doing that, perhaps refuting idols or something like that. Well, Nietzsche is an iconoclast, and like the Christian, he's tearing down idols. But unlike the Christian, he's tearing down Christianity, because he thinks that Christianity itself is idolatrous. Not because there's a true God that Christianity has forgotten how to worship. No, Nietzsche is still an atheist. Nietzsche is critiquing Christian ideas of God as false ideas of God. Instead of worshiping a real God, we worship our ideas of God. That's how Nietzsche thinks Christians actually behave, and he wants to tear down those idols. But you must not allow the image of smashing an idol with a hammer to get in the way. That is not what Nietzsche is doing. How does one philosophize with the hammer? Not by smashing the idols violently, but by tapping on them gently and sounding them out. In fact, the hammer is a tuning fork. It's not for violently smashing the idols, it is for tapping on them lightly to see if they ring hollow. Let's look at the foreword. It's no small trick to preserve your cheerfulness in the midst of a gloomy matter which is loaded with inordinate responsibility, yet what could be more necessary than cheerfulness? I just want to briefly mention that Nietzsche is not the depressing and depressed philosopher. At least he claims to be the cheerful philosopher. He considers himself a great optimist. He says some things about war. Perhaps we'll come back to that in a moment. Let's skip over the revaluation of values and the war. Let's get straight to the idols. Another way to recover, which under certain circumstances I like even better, that is even better than what he says about war. Another way to recover is sounding out idols. To pose questions here with a hammer for once, and maybe to hear in reply that well-known hollow tone. That is what Nietzsche is doing. Nietzsche is philosophizing with a hammer, which means not that he is smashing our ideas of God, as one smashes an idol, but that he is tapping gently on our ideas of God with his psychological philosophy, as one taps on an idol to see if it rings hollow. That is how one philosophizes with a hammer, not by smashing idols, but by sounding them out as with a tuning fork. And our new idols sounded out, he says. This little book is a great declaration of war. Back to war. It's a great declaration of war, and as for sounding out idols, this time they're not just idols of the age, but eternal idols that are touched here with the hammer, as with a tuning fork. There aren't any older idols at all, none more assured, none more inflated, and none more hollow. This doesn't stop them from being the ones that are most believed in, and especially in the most prominent case, they aren't called idols at all. There he's connecting himself pretty directly with how he is somewhat like and very much unlike a Christian. The most prominent case is Christianity. He's dealing with not just Christianity. He is a critic of many things. Virtually everything, probably even including himself. Nietzsche is a great critic, and he's not only going to criticize Christianity. He is criticizing and declaring war against, but I think this should be understood as a metaphorical war. He is metaphorically declaring war against the idols. But the idols are our corrupt ideas. And these ideas are the ideas that have always corrupted human civilization, and they are not only Christianity, but Christianity does happen to be the most prominent case of the ideas that most needed to be sounded out with a hammer as with a tuning fork. Not smashed, but sounded out to see if they ring hollow. That is what this book is about. The second of a series for the Philosophers in Their Own Words playlist on Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols, and probably combined for the Great Text playlist. Let's skip over the epigrams and arrows, though they are well worth reading, and you might find a number of them fairly interesting. As in, if you have your why for life, you can get by with almost any how, and so on. But let's just not interpret the epigrams for our purposes. Let's go to the Problem of Socrates. The wisest sages of all times have reached the same judgment about life. It's worthless. Always and everywhere we have heard the same sound coming from their mouths. A sound full of doubt, full of melancholy, full of fatigue with life, full of hostility to life. Even Socrates said, as he died, "Living, that means being sick a long time. I owe a rooster to the savior, Asclepius." Now, the backstory is in Plato's Phaedo. When Socrates dies, he says something about owing a rooster to Asclepius. Asclepius is the god of healing. Owing a rooster means you owe a sacrifice to Asclepius. You have been healed, you owe a sacrifice expressing your debt to Asclepius. When Socrates dies, he is saying, as he says, we owe a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing, he is saying, I have now been healed. I owe gratitude to the god of healing. How is he being healed while he's dying? Well, because life is the disease. That is at least one fairly straightforward and common way of reading this passage in Plato. This seems to be how Nietzsche is reading the passage in Plato. Socrates is full of fatigue with life, full of hostility to life. The idea, the central idea that Nietzsche is critiquing in Twilight of the Idols is the idea that life is worthless. So again, as he says in the very beginning, in the foreword, in the very first sentence, when he talks about cheerfulness, he is saying that he is an optimistic philosopher. What he is critiquing is a pessimism, a pessimistic view of life that devalues life. He is critiquing the idea of life that says life is worthless. There is something which is to be valued, which is beyond this life, and this life itself is worthless. He is critiquing the devaluing of life by human civilization. Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols, here under the Problem of Socrates. Judgments, value judgments about life, for or against, can in the final analysis never be true. They have value only as symptoms. They can be considered only as symptoms. In themselves, such judgments are stupidities. One absolutely must reach out and try to grasp this astounding finesse that the value of life cannot be assessed. Not by the living, since they are parties to the dispute, and in fact, they are the objects of contention, and not the judges, and not by the dead, for another reason. So, Nietzsche is talking about how the assessment of the value of life as being worthless is not an objective assessment. And he talks about how the value of life cannot be objectively assessed at all. It cannot be assessed by the living because they are parties to the dispute. So when we try to assess the value of life, we are part of that life that we are assessing. If we try to make some judgment about the value of life, we are not neutral. We cannot make an objective judgment. Value judgments about life, for or against, can never be true. They have value only as symptoms. So what does that mean? Well, they are symptoms of life. A value judgment about life is made by the living. It is something the living do. It is an expression of the life of the living. Now, the fact that they can never be objective, because we have no way of making an objective assessment about life. We are the living. We are trying to look in on ourselves, and you can't look in on yourself from outside of yourself. We don't have that kind of perspective. We don't have the God's eye perspective for looking down on life from outside of life, so we can't render an objective value judgment about life. There's no such possibility, according to Nietzsche. The fact that you cannot make an objective value judgment about life does not mean that there's no way to distinguish between one value judgment and another. Every value judgment about life is an expression of life. and some expressions of life are more healthy than others. And the value judgment about life that Nietzsche is talking about here specifically, the judgment from the very beginning of the Problem of Socrates here, on which I suppose see the previous video, that the wisest sages of all time have concluded that life is worthless. That value judgment is a symptom of a weak and declining life. We can assess it. We can't assess it as objectively true or objectively false. There's no access to such a perspective on life. But that does not mean that the value of life cannot be assessed. It just cannot be assessed objectively. It can be assessed as an expression of life. And you can render a judgment about the value of life. Some judgments about the value of life are not healthy expressions of life, such as the value judgment Nietzsche is critiquing in this book. Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols. Now reading from the section called Reason in Philosophy. Reason, so-called. You ask me what's idiosyncratic about philosophers, says Nietzsche. There is, for instance, their lack of a sense of history, their hatred for the very notion of becoming. Skipping a bit. These gentlemen who idolize concept, that is how Nietzsche describes these philosophers he's talking about. He's talking about philosophers who dislike the idea of becoming. What they believe in is pure, unchanging, perfect being. They don't like becoming. Becoming is a concept that represents change. What they like, these philosophers, is perfect, unchanging being. And so they idolize their concept. They are gentlemen who idolize concepts. They idolize their concept of perfect being. What they should be doing is recognizing that becoming, the state of reality as in change, in flux, a reality in motion, is real, and it's not something you should be hating. Now, they all believe, desperately even, in what is, but since they can't get it into their clutches, they look for reasons why it's being withheld from them. They all believe in unchanging being, in what is, not in what is becoming. There is this ancient question in metaphysics. Is reality ultimately changing or unchanging? Beginning at least as early as Parmenides in the pre-Socratic tradition, some philosophers said that ultimate reality is not changing. Ultimate reality is being. And others, again, beginning at least as early as Heraclitus, whom Nietzsche will mention on this very page, beginning at least as early as Heraclitus in the pre-Socratic tradition, some say, no, change is real. Ultimately, what is real is a changing reality. But Nietzsche is talking about the philosophy that has, for the most part, been dominant in Western history. They all believe desperately even in what is, in perfect being. But since they can't get it into their clutches, they look for reasons why it's being withheld from them. They believe that ultimate reality must be unchanging, perfect being, but they don't seem to have access to it, so they look for some explanation for why they can't get perfect being into their heads. There has to be an illusion, a deception at work, that prevents us from deceiving what is. Where is the deceiver? These philosophers ask. We've got the deceiver, they cry happily. It's sensation. It's the senses. He's still putting words, he's paraphrasing the thoughts of the philosophers. These senses, which are so immoral anyway, deceive us about the true world. There's a wonderful passage later in this text about the true world. The moral, free yourself from the senses' deceit, from becoming, from history, from the lie. History is nothing but belief in the senses, belief in the lie. Moral, say no to everything that lends credence to the senses, to all the rest of humanity. All that is just the masses, the ignorant masses. Be a philosopher, be a mummy. Portray monotonotheism with gravedigger's pantomime, and above all, away with the body, etc., etc. Let me try to paraphrase this and wrap up this video. A lot of philosophers have held that ultimate reality must be perfect, unchanging being. That is what would be ultimately real, and that the changing reality that we perceive in our lives must therefore be an illusion. Change must be an illusion. What is ultimately real must be unchanging. Nietzsche fiercely disagrees. Also on the same page, I set aside with great respect the name of Heraclitus, because there are those philosophers who have recognized the reality of change. But the dominant tradition, at least as Nietzsche understands it, with some reason to understand it this way, the dominant tradition has recognized ultimate reality as unchanging. And Nietzsche says that these philosophers who recognize ultimate reality as unchanging are looking for an explanation for the fact that they can't seem to perceive it. Instead, they perceive a reality that is changing. And so they blame the body and they blame the five senses of the body for deceiving them about ultimate reality. And so their moral is, well, away with the senses, away with the body, reject the testimony of senses, reject the testimony of experience, and reject the body and cling to that which the mind alone can understand. And in general, away with the changing reality of our perception. Thus Nietzsche critiques the philosophers. This is their idea of reason, this is their idea of being, and it's a bad idea. Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols, again from Reason in Philosophy. Here Nietzsche is critiquing the philosophical idolization of the idea of being, the idea that ultimate reality must be what is and not what is becoming, what is perfect, unchanging being, instead of the reality we see before us, quite literally, the reality we perceive with our senses, the reality that is in a state of change. Many philosophers have thought change is not real. Ultimate reality is perfect, unchanging being, and therefore the testimony of our senses, and perhaps the entire body along with it, must be rejected as giving us the illusion of changing reality. Now in the Hindu tradition, that illusion is called Maya. Pardon me if my pronunciation is poor. M-A-Y-A is the transliteration I'm familiar with. And Nietzsche, although his main focus is Christianity and the errors, at least as he understands it, of Western philosophy from pre-Socratics and very much prominent in Plato and all the way down to Kant, he really dislikes Kant. And again, Christianity. These are the major targets, especially Christianity, but he's an equal opportunity critic. Although these are his major targets, he does pause. I want to briefly mention that he pauses to critique the Hindu tradition. Here in Reason and Philosophy, section 5, and in India, as in Greece, they made the same mistake. And here's what they said: we must already have been at home in a higher world at one time. We must have been divine, since we have reason. According to Hinduism, or at least the dominant Hindu tradition as it's popularly understood, ultimate reality is God. Ultimate reality is Brahman. The ultimate reality is Brahman, the God who is or who contains everything. And this ultimate reality is unchanging. And ultimately, we are divine. That is what we are. And the testimony of our senses, it's an illusion. It creates the illusion of something that is not Brahman. It creates the illusion that we are not Brahman. Ultimately, we must realize our own divinity. And as Nietzsche describes it, the Indian philosophical mistake is pretty much the same as that of the Greeks, or at least many of the Greeks. Again, I set aside with great respect the name of Heraclitus. In the Western philosophical tradition, we do have exceptions, philosophers who recognize the reality of change. But the dominant tradition in Greece has been to deny the reality of change. The dominant Western tradition, going back to the Greek philosophers, has been to deny the reality of change. And in India, as in Greece, they made the same mistake. The mistake of denying the testimony of the senses because they thought ultimate reality was unchanging and divine. And also, the human being must ultimately be considered a god, unchanging, divine, because we have reason to reject the testimony of our senses. He is, again, critiquing intellectual idols, false ideas of God. From Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols. Now, before even reading this section, let me compliment a former student. He was my lord and master at chess, and not surprisingly, has a good analytical mind. He liked his philosophy straightforward. He liked his philosophy to follow the, let's call it the treatise side. Treatise, T-R-E-A-T-I-S-E. This is a book like the writings of Spinoza, or the writings of Leibniz, or the writings of Locke, or the writings of Aristotle, a book where the philosopher says, this is what I think, Here's why, and presents his views in an orderly fashion. This particular student did not like the literary side of philosophy. The literary side of philosophy is the side of philosophy where the philosopher writes dialogues, conversations between two different characters, or where the philosopher writes stories, or where the philosopher writes poetry. On one side of philosophy, the Trendy side, we have the surviving works of Aristotle, we have Thomas Aquinas, we have John Locke, Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant, we have most of the writings of Hume, and so on. Modern analytical English-speaking philosophy. And on the other side, the literary side of philosophy, we have the writings of Plato. We have most of the works of Augustine, I would classify here. We have Boethius, Consolation of Philosophy. We have some writings of Hume. Hume wrote some dialogues, and we have Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, and some modern continental European philosophers as well. This particular student was, he loved the Trendy side of philosophy. He liked Spinoza kind of philosophy. And, again, he's my master in chess. So he has that kind of mind. Me, I love the literary side of philosophy. I like the other side too, but as a rule, I usually enjoy the literary side of philosophy more. Well, Nietzsche is very much on the literary side of philosophy, and one of his greatest books, Thus Spake Zarathustra, is a gigantic work of literature. Well, Twilight of the Idols is mostly on the literary side, but here is a passage where Nietzsche pauses to state things almost systematically. Here's how it goes. We are in Section 6 of Reason and Philosophy in the Twilight of the Idols. You will be thankful to me if I condense such an essential and new insight into 4 theses. I thus make it easier to understand, and I dare you to contradict it. So he is stepping over towards the trendy side of philosophy and away from the literary side just a bit, but it really is just a bit. His rhetoric, I dare you to contradict my theses. First proposition. The grounds on which this world has been called apparent are instead grounds for its reality. Another kind of reality is absolutely indemonstrable. Second proposition, the distinguishing marks which have been given to the true being of things, quote, end quote, are the distinguishing marks of non-being, of nothingness. The, quote, true world, end quote, has been constructed by contradicting the actual world. This true world is in fact an apparent world, insofar as it is just a moral optical delusion. Third proposition, it makes no sense whatsoever to tell fictional stories about another world than this one, as long as the instinct to slander, trivialize, and look down upon life is not powerful within us. In that case, we revenge ourselves on life with the phantasmagoria of another, better life. Fourth proposition, dividing the world into a true and an apparent world, whether in the style of Christianity or in the style of Kant, a sneaky Christian to the end, Kant is a sneaky Christian, is merely a move inspired by decadence, a symptom of declining life. I will stop there and try to paraphrase and summarize this for you a little more systematically than Nietzsche does. He's talking about intellectual idols, ideas people have worshipped, particularly the idea of a higher reality, a higher world which is thought to be better than this world, which is thought to be ultimate reality, true reality. The idea of a true world which is beyond this world, and the rejection of this world as some sort of lower reality or merely an illusion. He's talking about the idea that ultimate reality must be being, unchanging being, a perfect is, and not a thing in state of becoming. Ultimate reality must be that, according to the ideas Nietzsche is critiquing. And this life, as the illusion of a reality in change, must therefore be despised, disdained, rejected, and we must move past the body and embrace pure reason. He's critiquing this sort of idea, and he says, in fact, the grounds on which this world, the world of our senses, the world of our experience, has been called apparent, as in the grounds on which this world that we perceive with our bodies to be in a state of change, the grounds on which this world that we perceive has been accused of not being the real world, are actually grounds for its reality. Our experience of a world in change is actually grounds for recognizing reality actually is in change. The world we perceive with our senses is real. The distinguishing marks which have been given to the true being of things are the distinguishing marks of non-being, of nothingness. Those philosophers from the East from the West, those Christians, but also that Kant and those Platos and others who have said that the characteristic of true reality, that it is perfect and unchanging, is actually an indication that such a thing does not exist. The idea of a perfect, unchanging, higher world is said to be real because it's so perfect and unchanging, and so on. Well, this is grounds that such an idea is a fiction. There is no such thing. There is no such place. There is no such world. There is no such higher reality. And it makes no sense whatsoever to tell fictional stories about some higher world, some higher reality. And that is to say, it makes no sense as long as we have no instinct to slander, trivialize, and look down upon life. Now, if we do, we revenge ourselves on life. In other words, people who have weak, declining forms of life have an instinct to dislike life. They have a distaste for life, and it is out of a distaste for life that they stray into otherworldliness. They have a distaste for life in this world where they can't thrive. Basically they're weak, pathetic losers. And that's why they want to believe in some higher reality as a way of getting revenge against this reality where they're weak and pathetic losers. Escapism might be the best word for what's motivating them. Remember, Nietzsche is a psychologist. His remarks in the foreword about how one philosophizes, that being the subtitle, with a hammer. His remarks in the foreword about how one philosophizes with a hammer are largely based in psychology. Nietzsche is one of the more psychological of the philosophers. There we go, page 3 in the foreword. For me, the old psychologist, etc., has to speak up. Nietzsche is looking at the psychology of, all these people who have these intellectual idols, these ideas that they worship, the philosophers, and especially the Christians, worshiping their ideas of being and their ideas of God. Their real motive for worshiping these ideas of some higher reality and disdaining this world, their real motive, escapism, is maybe the best word for it. That's Nietzsche's psychological critique. Fourth proposition, the idea of dividing reality into the true world and the apparent world, the world of our experiences, is inspired by decadence. It's a symptom of declining life. Again, the motivation to divide the reality into true reality, the ultimate reality, Brahman, or perfect being, or Plato's forms, or Kant's noumenal world, or especially God, according to the Christians. The idea of dividing reality into this ultimate reality and this lower reality, the world of our experiences, the physical world, that idea is motivated by weakness. It's a symptom of having a weak and declining form of life. The real reason for it is that one is a pathetic loser in this world. That's why one dreams of a better world. From Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols, How the True World Finally Became a Fiction. A very short reading, just barely more than one page, but one of the richest short readings in the entire history of philosophy. And it is about the history of philosophy. As a commentary on the history of philosophy goes, I'm not sure it's all that impressive. It is dealing with some caricatures of different perspectives in the history of philosophy, and may not be entirely accurate. It does draw out some themes that are really there in the history of philosophy. I love this passage, not for the accuracy of its commentary on the history of philosophy, but because it is itself such a beautiful piece of the history of philosophy. Let's look at what he says. He says, there are 6 sections to How the True World Finally Became a Fiction. Note the subtitle, The History of an Error. How the True World Finally Became a Fiction. The first section, the true world, attainable for the wise, the devout, the virtuous, they live in it, they are it. And then parenthetically Nietzsche says, oldest form of the idea. Relatively clever, simple, convincing. Paraphrase of the assertion, I, Plato, am the truth. In other words, the first chapter in the history of philosophy Nietzsche is commenting on here is Plato, where he talks about the true world, the higher reality, the ultimate reality, which is non-physical and beyond this world, beyond our perceptions, known only through the mind, not through the body. This world is the true world according to Plato. And how do you get to it? By being wise, devout, virtuous, by thinking very highly of yourself, by acting like Plato. And the true world becomes shorthand for I, Plato, am so awesome. I, Plato, can know the truth. Plato has some respect for himself, at least. Nietzsche is going to dislike the next stage in the history of philosophy even more than Plato, I believe. The next stage, section 2, the true world, unattainable for now, but promised to the wise, the devout, the virtuous, to the sinner who does penance. Parenthetically, progress of the idea. It becomes more refined, more devious, more mystified. It becomes woman. It becomes Christian. Second stage, Christianity. Or perhaps the medieval era of Christian philosophy. Or maybe it's better to just say the whole Christian culture that dominates Europe from, roughly 200, 300 AD, somewhere around then, until roughly late Enlightenment era. And in this cultural context, the idea of the true world is an idea of God, an idea of heaven, or an idea of the kingdom of God, which is understood in non-physical terms, which is beyond this world, beyond this life, and attainable not for the person who, like Plato, actually has some respect for himself, but attainable for the sinner who repents. In other words, we've moved from a denial of life with Plato, but a sort of affirmation of oneself, to a denial of life with Christianity accompanied by a denial of oneself. And things don't get better from here. Next stage is Kant. Section 3, the true world, unattainable, unprovable, unpromisable, but a consolation, an obligation, an imperative, merely by virtue of being thought. The old sun, basically, but glimpsed through fog and skepticism, says Nietzsche, parenthetically. The idea becomes sublime, pallid, Nordic, Königsbergian. Königsbergian means he's talking about Kant. Königsberg is where Kant is from. Note also the word imperative. He's referencing Kant's categorical imperative. The true world, unattainable, unprovable, unpromisable, this is what Kant said about the ultimate reality. The higher reality is non-physical reality. The ultimate reality, as the Christian said, is God and the soul. That's the Augustinian version anyway. And in Kant, we have a very similar picture. There is an immaterial soul, a non-physical soul. There is God. There is life after death. In many respects, it's very similar to Christianity and to Plato. These are, of course, non-physical things. They exist beyond the physical world of our perceptions. But in Kant, you can't know them. You can't attain to them, at least not in this life. There's no attaining, there's no proof, there's no promise, unattainable, unprovable, unpromisable, and yet a consolation, an obligation, an imperative, merely by virtue of being thought, merely by virtue of being thought, we are able, the ideas are able to inspire in us an obligation, an imperative, and a consolation. In morality, in Kant, the idea of God and the soul become necessary accoutrements to morality. Or maybe I'm interpreting Kant improperly here when I say it that way. Let me try saying this. They become the foundation of morality, the idea of a non-physical human soul which is not controlled by matter and therefore is free to make its own decisions. It's necessary for the idea of free will to work, which is necessary for the idea of morality. That's a Kantian perspective. But you can't prove any of these things, you just have to believe them. Meanwhile, the idea of God beyond this world is a consolation in morality. The next stage describes the effects of Kant. Nietzsche says, section 4 now, the true world, unattainable, in any case unattained, and if it is unattained, it is also unknown. And hence it is not consoling, redeeming, or obligating either. To what could something unknown obligate us? Parenthetically, he says, grey dawn, first yawnings of reason, rooster's crow of positivism. This is the effects of Kant. If the true world is not attainable, then, and if it is not attained, then it is unknown. And how can something unknown produce in us any kind of an obligation? This is not the foundation of morality. In fact, what we should do is recognize that if Kant is correct about the true world, the higher reality, being unknowable, then we should conclude this is actually exactly what Kant does not say it is. Exactly what Kant says it is not. The true world is not a source of obligation. This higher world is not the foundation of morality. What we should do is break free of this idea. And that's where we go with the next section, section 5. The true world. An idea with no use anymore, no longer even obligating. An idea become useless, superfluous, hence a refuted idea. Let's do away with it. Parenthetically. Bright day, breakfast, return of good sense and cheerfulness, Plato blushes, pandemonium of all free spirits. So many references. Pandemonium of all free spirits. This appears to be a reference to Paradise Lost, Milton's Paradise Lost. Plato blushes. Oh, that's a reference to characters in Plato blushing when they get thoroughly refuted by Socrates. Oh, the reference to the sun earlier was a reference to Plato's cave analogy and analogy of the sun in the middle books of Plato's Republic, where the sun is a symbol for the higher world. But in fact, with the realization that the old Platonic sun is now veiled in Kantian clouds, glimpsed through fog and skepticism back in section 3, and therefore useless for us, section 4. Now, section 5, Nietzsche says, just throw out the whole thing, throw out the whole idea, and then realize this world is real. This is where we have sunlight. Take it literally and metaphorically. This is the world of the sun. This is the true world. Bright day, breakfast, good sense, cheerfulness, free spirits. This is a good thing. Getting rid of the idea of the higher world means the higher world having become useless, since it's unknown and unattainable, gets thrown out, and we are free of it, and we're free to enjoy life in this world and to affirm life in this world. Section 6. We have done away with the true world. What world is left over? The apparent one, maybe? But no, along with the true world, we have also done away with the apparent. Parenthetically, Nietzsche says, midnight, moment of the shortest shadow, end of the longest error, high point of humanity, incipit Zarathustra. Now, this might sound like a very depressing take on things. It might sound like he's saying, well, we've thrown out the true world. We had the Platonic version, the Christian version, the Kantian version, then we realized the effects of Kant. It's unattainable, unattained, therefore it's not a consolation, it's not a source of redemption or obligation. Something unknown doesn't obligate us. Therefore, let's throw it out and be free. And then Nietzsche says, we've done away with the true world. What world is left over? Not the apparent world, the world we experience, the world of our senses, the physical world, this world. Not this world. No, we've tossed out the apparent world with the true world. This might be taken to be a very depressing conclusion, perhaps a statement of nihilism. Nietzsche has said, or so we might interpret him, Nietzsche has said, we've tossed out all source of meaning, because all source of meaning was in reference to the higher reality, the true world. But in fact, I think that's exactly what we're not supposed to do. Nietzsche's not telling us, oh, now you have to be depressed because there's no purpose in life anymore. He's telling you, you have a very heavy responsibility now to create the purpose of life. What we have done away with is not the reality or the importance or the seriousness of this world. What we have done away with is its definition as a mere illusion, a mere apparent world. In the old distinction between the true higher world and the lower physical world, we have an idea of a true reality and an apparent reality, a real world and an illusory world. And in doing away with the whole real world concept, we've just been left with this lower thing, which, now that we are not making a distinction between true and apparent world, can no longer be called the apparent world. That doesn't mean, though, that it's not a world at all. We're not doing away with the whole world. We're doing away with the idea that it's a merely apparent world. It is a merely illusory world. We're doing away with that notion, and now we're left with the idea of just the world. This is the world. Hence, midday, moment of the shortest shadow, end of the longest error, the high point of humanity. Incipit Zarathustra, the beginning, the entrance of Zarathustra. Zarathustra is Nietzsche's character, to keep it very brief, Nietzsche's character in his great work of literature, Thus Spake Zarathustra, where Zarathustra proclaims that we have killed God, not literally, but the idea of God is no longer culturally useful for us, and now we have to be responsible for creating meaning in the world without reference to God. And Zarathustra might be taken as himself the character who is, in Nietzschean terminology, the overman, the new humanity or the replacement for humanity, the new way of being human, the person who creates his own meaning in life, having done away with all these ideas, like the idea of the true world, that prevent us from affirming this life and affirming ourselves in this world. Zarathustra might be taken that way, and he might be taken as a representative for Nietzsche. I'm inclined to a more cautious reading. I tend to think of Nietzsche as pointing in this direction, but not himself calling himself the overman. I think maybe even Zarathustra himself is not proclaiming himself to be the overman. So it might be that this is not this midday moment of the shortest shadow, end of the longest era, high point of humanity. It might be that this is not the time when Nietzsche comes forth and proclaims, now I will show you the better way. I think he's now telling you, now humanity, being free of this ancient error, must itself create its own way. He's not pointing to himself. He's pointing to the future and to what we have to do in the future. Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols. I'm going to be reading a few passages from this section, Morality as Anti-Nature. Nietzsche says, the church fights passion by cutting it out in every sense. Its practice, its therapy, is castration. It never asks, how does one spiritualize, beautify, deify a desire? Its discipline has always emphasized eradication of sensuality, pride, the ambition to rule, covetousness, vengefulness, by ripping out the passions by the root. But ripping out the passions by the root means ripping out life by the root. The practice of the church is an enemy to life. The same means castration, eradication is instinctively chosen in the struggle against a desire by those who are too weak-willed, too degenerate to modify their own desire, etc., etc. Radical means are indispensable only for degenerates. Having a weak will, or more precisely, being incapable of not reacting to a stimulus, is itself just another form of degeneration. I put a principle into a formula. All naturalism and morality, that is, all healthy morality, is ruled by an instinct of life. Some decree of life is fulfilled by a particular canon of shall and shall not. Some restriction and hostility on life's path is thereby shoved aside. Anti-natural morality, that is, almost every morality that has been taught, honored, and preached up to now, instead turns precisely against the instincts of life. It is a sometimes hidden, sometimes loud and bold condemnation of these instincts. By saying God looks into the heart, it says no to the lowest and highest desires of life and takes God to be life's enemy. The saint in whom God delights is the ideal eunuch. Life ends where the kingdom of God begins. When we speak of values, we speak under the inspiration, under the optics of life. Life itself is forcing us to posit values. Life itself is valuing by means of us when we posit values. Morality, insofar as it condemns on its own grounds and not from the point of view of life's perspectives and objectives, is a specific error for which one should have no sympathy, an idiosyncrasy of degenerates, which has done an unspeakable amount of harm. In contrast, we others, we immoralists, that is, we so-called immoralists, have opened our hearts wide to every form of understanding, comprehending, approving. We do not easily negate. We seek our honor in being those who affirm. We, so-called immoralists, who critique morality, we are actually affirmers, not pure critics. We criticize only to affirm, and specifically to affirm life. Okay, what is going on in this section of the Twilight of the Idols? Morality as anti-nature. It's fairly clear that this is a critique of Christian sexual ethics. Nietzsche thinks it's an anti-life kind of ethics. Where does life come from? Where does new life come from? From sex. And what does Christianity critique, seek to control, perhaps to eradicate? Sex. Or at least sexual desire. And this is not to be restricted so narrowly. This is a more general critique of Christian ethics, and in fact it's a more general critique of all traditional morality, or that is to say, all ethics that resist human desire and human will. Life creates desire and will. Traditional morality, whether Platonic, Christian, Kantian, etc., traditional morality tends to deny both desire and will. Now, this is Nietzsche's critique. I don't think this is at all fair to Christian ethics. For example, Augustine is all about the the affirmation of desire. Not by any means the eradication, perhaps the healing, perhaps the redirection. The Nietzschean language here, it never asks, how does one spiritualize, beautify, deify desire? That's precisely what Augustine asks. You see a nice depiction of this in The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, where the lizard thing, representing base lust, turns into a stallion that carries a soul off to heaven. So I don't think this is an accurate critique of traditional morality, at least not of Christian morality. But anyway, this is Nietzsche's critique of traditional morality. But this is also one of his clearest statements of his own ethics. Yes, Nietzsche has an ethics. The ethics is the affirmation of life. And there's not much else we really need to say about it. Nietzsche's ethics is to affirm life. We can say a little bit more about the materialism and the psychology that is connected to this ethics, and we can clarify one or two things. When Nietzsche says affirm life and anti-natural morality that resists human desire and human will is unhealthy and bad and comes from a degenerate, declining form of life, he's not saying that what we should do is indulge all our desires, try to get as much food, drink, sex, or whatever it is. Most of us probably go with sex. Try to get as much as possible. Eat all the ice cream you can as quickly as you can. He's not saying that. That's not healthy either. A healthy desire has an ascetic streak. A-S-C-E-T-I-C. An ascetic streak. A-S-C-E-T-I-C. Healthy morality is able to resist some desires. How does he put it? The same means castration, eradication of desire is instinctively chosen in the struggle against a desire by those who are too weak-willed, too degenerate to modify their own desires. A healthy morality will deal with some obstacle on life's way. A healthy morality will, by some particular canon of shall and shall not, some set of rules saying you shall do this, you shall not do that, which will moderate or control or resist certain human desires. A healthy morality that does this is doing so in order that some restriction and hostility on life's path may be thereby shoved aside. In other words, healthy morality is prepared to resist our desires, but it is done so out of the affirmation of life. And the crucial, one really crucial point is that Nietzsche's materialistic psychological analysis of morality posits that a moral theory is itself produced by life. Life itself posits values through us. Life itself is forcing us to posit values. Life itself is valuing by means of us when we posit values. And an unhealthy life is the subconscious source that Nietzsche is trying to expose. An unhealthy, weak form of life is the unconscious source Nietzsche is trying to expose for those moralities that focus on denying the instincts of life. A healthy morality would affirm life, because a healthy morality comes from a healthy life which is strong enough to affirm itself, to assert itself, a life which is healthy enough to love life. And again, that does not mean that all our desires are affirmed. No, but there's a difference between one ascetic and another ascetic, A-S-C-E-T-I-C. An ascetic is someone who denies physical desires. One will do so out of a hatred for life. Picture the monk who self-flagellates, the guy who whips himself. Maybe you've seen such a character in a movie. Or the monk, maybe a Buddhist monk, maybe a Christian monk, who denies all desires and practically starves himself, maybe literally starves himself because he thinks the body is evil, all physical desires are evil, I must overcome and escape them. Perhaps so that my soul may then flutter off to heaven without the body. A healthy asceticism will deny physical desires out of a love of life, because it's healthier. Out of self-affirmation, not out of self-denial, but out of affirmation of self. I am strong enough. This is Nietzschean asceticism, A-S-C-E-T-I-S, A-S-C-E-T-I-S-M, asceticism. Nietzschean asceticism will deny desires, not out of denial of self, but out of self-affirmation. Certain desires will be denied because the strong Nietzschean ascetic will say, I am so strong and so awesome that I don't even need those things. It's not that. my body is evil, my desires are evil, I am evil, therefore I must deny my desires for sex, ice cream, or whatever. The Nietzschean ascetic will say, I am so awesome, I don't even need sex or ice cream. Again, the Nietzschean ascetic might realize that certain things are obstacles on the path of life. Some desires are perhaps a restriction and hostility on life's path which need to be set aside. Maybe some desires are just not healthy enough, or some desires are getting in the way of my affirmation of myself in my own life. My own project for my own life does not involve indulgence in certain things, so I refuse them. But again, not out of self-denial, but out of self-affirmation. That's the Nietzschean ascetic way. And the fundamental principle, the central principle, and a two-word summary of a whole lot of Nietzsche is affirm life. Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols, from the section Those Who Improve Humanity. My demand on philosophers is well known, that they place themselves beyond good and evil, that they put the illusion of moral judgment beneath them. This demand follows from an insight which was formulated for the first time by me, that there are no moral facts at all. Moral judgments have this in common with religious ones. They believe in realities that are unreal. Morality is just an interpretation of certain phenomena, or, speaking more precisely, a misinterpretation. This video is just to read these words from Nietzsche and give a very brief comment on what it means. If you've been watching this series of remarks from Twilight of the Idols, I don't think you'll find us anything new here. This is just a review, for the most part, and these particular words. Some of them are perhaps more clear than some of his other remarks, but the point is fairly simple, straightforward, and familiar to those who've been reading Nietzsche. The idea that there are no moral facts at all is crucial in Nietzsche. Moral judgments, like religious judgments, appeal to realities that are unreal. Morality is merely an interpretation, or, speaking more precisely, a misinterpretation. This does not mean that there can be no value judgments that are, in some sense, better than others. What it means is that our specifically moral judgments are symptoms of life. There is no access to a God's eye view of life from outside of life from which we can evaluate life and make objective moral judgments. No, instead what happens is life itself is what we are, or we are part of life, or we are living, or something, some such formulation. Life itself values through us. Our values are expressions of life, and some expressions of life are more healthy than others, and some are unhealthy, and that's where we get specifically moral value judgments. But some value judgments, particularly those that simply affirm life, are better than others. They're not objectively better, because we have no objective standard by which we can make such a claim. What they are is more healthy. Healthy life affirms life. That, as I understand it, is the general idea Nietzsche is getting at. Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols, towards the end of the text now, a passage from What the Germans Are Missing. Nietzsche says, section 6 here, in order not to be untrue to my type, which is a yes-saying type, and deals in contradictions and criticism only indirectly, only unwillingly, I will set forth right away the 3 tasks for which educators are required. One must learn to see, one must learn to think, one must learn to speak and write. The goal of all 3 tasks is a noble culture. Now, we could talk about philosophy of education here, but all I really want to say is that what he says here, almost parenthetically, is pretty important, and another fairly clear statement of one aspect of Nietzsche that has often been underappreciated. Nietzsche is not a depressed philosopher, or at any rate, he claims not to be depressed. He claims to be a great optimist. He says his type of thinker is a yes-saying type, and deals in contradictions and criticism only indirectly, only unwillingly. Nietzsche wants to affirm, not to deny. Nietzsche doesn't want to critique, except to critique that which itself is a critique of life. Nietzsche is out to affirm life. That is the point of Nietzsche. This is not a nihilism. This is, in its own way, not even an... Although it's not even an attempt to teach some objective perspective in ethics, it is in its own way a perspective in ethics. It is a view on the good life. Nietzsche is out to affirm life. The optimistic assessment of life is the good life. That is Nietzsche's view on the meaning of life.